Welcome to today's explainer, where we're going to put on our auditor hats to uncover exactly how external demands morph into hard operational rules within an environmental management system. If you're involved in environmental governance, you already know that ISO 14001-2026 has significantly raised the bar. It's really no longer just about, checking a box. It's about building a dynamic, responsive system. So today, we're tracing that fascinating thread from a broad stakeholder expectation all the way down to a very specific compliance obligation. Let's kick things off with a slightly provocative thought. Who actually dictates your environmental compliance? Is it just government regulators and statutory laws? Or is the reality much, much more complex? Because under this updated ISO 14001 framework, if you think compliance is solely the domain of your local environmental protection agency, you're honestly already setting your organization up for a major nonconformance. The reality is, the authors of your environmental rules are literally all around you. Okay, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with stakeholders, move right into deriving obligations, explore the compliance register, look at the key register criteria, and then wrap up with some common audit nonconformances. Starting off with Section 1, Stakeholders and Interested Parties.
You see, environmental management is absolutely not a solo sport. It's heavily driven by both external and internal pressures. An interested party isn't just an inspector walking around with a clipboard. It's anyone who has a stake in your environmental footprint. The standard requires you to systematically identify these parties and really figure out exactly what they expect from you.
Look at these key players for a second. Yes, for sure, you've got regulatory bodies setting hard emission limits, but you've also got customers demanding eco-friendly packaging. You have investors holding your feet to the fire on corporate sustainability pledges. You even have local communities expecting you to keep the noise pollution down. Every single one of these groups is an interested party, and their expectations carry serious weight. Moving on to Section 2, Deriving Compliance Obligations. So the crucial takeaway here is that compliance in this ISO standard isn't just about statutory laws. Look really closely at that definition. It includes requirements an organization must comply with and those it chooses to comply with. The framework demands that you determine which of those stakeholder expectations we just talked about actually translate into formal compliance obligations. Notice the huge contrast here. On the left, we've got mandatory legal requirements, things like municipal wastewater permits. Violate those, and you get fined. Simple. But on the right, we have voluntary commitments, like a public pledge to your investors to hit net zero carbon. Here is the secret that ISO 14001-2026 lead auditors know. Once your company publicly adopts that voluntary pledge, it becomes just as binding to an auditor as a government permit. It essentially transforms into a formal compliance obligation. We call this the traceability thread. It's basically a 4-step journey. First, you identify the stakeholder's need, let's say a client wanting restricted substances in their supply chain. Second, you evaluate its relevance to your specific environmental context. Third, you officially adopt it as a compliance obligation. And finally, you implement an operational control to enforce it right down on the factory floor. If an auditor pulls on this thread, it has to hold together from end to end. Which brings us to Section 3, the Compliance Obligation Register. Think of this register as the central nervous system of your compliance, the ultimate auditor's blueprint. It's a documented repository housing every single legal requirement, permit condition, and voluntary pledge your organization has taken on. If an obligation isn't accurately recorded here, your operational controls are essentially flying blind. I mean, you can't manage, monitor, or train your staff on a rule that your system doesn't officially recognize, right? Section 4, Currency, Completeness, and Legal Accuracy. Now we're looking at the big 3. This is the exact mental framework an ISO 14001 lead auditor uses to spot systemic weaknesses in your organization. They're looking for currency. Is it actually up to date? Completeness. Did you miss any stakeholders? And legal accuracy. Did you interpret complex thresholds correctly? Let's break these down one by one. First step is currency. Look, environmental law is not static. It evolves constantly with new technology and climate data. For instance, if a new regional law introduces stricter nitrogen oxide limits for your boilers, well, your register has to reflect that update immediately. If an auditor finds out you're operating off a register that hasn't been reviewed in 2 years, that's a massive red flag. You absolutely must have a systematic process for tracking these updates. Next is completeness, which is all about eliminating your blind spots. Let's say your multinational company starts operating in a new market, but you fail to log local soil contamination laws. Or maybe you signed an industry code of conduct, but entirely forgot to add it to the register. If those pieces are missing, your register is fundamentally incomplete, and your risk management is seriously compromised. Finally, legal accuracy. This requires real expert interpretation of the rules. For example, applying a municipal wastewater limit to a heavy industrial chemical discharge is a huge legal inaccuracy. You might think you're perfectly compliant, but you're measuring against the wrong yardstick. Auditors are going to flag this instantly because inaccurate interpretation always leads to ineffective environmental controls. And finally, Section 5, Common Audit Non-Conformances. Let's see where things usually go wrong. A major non-conformance gets written up the moment an auditor discovers you're running your systems based on outdated baselines. So often, companies will just buy a generic list of environmental laws and then never tailor it to their specific production capacities or update it when the laws inevitably change. You literally cannot manage today's environmental risks with yesterday's regulatory assumptions.
Listen to this direct quote from the source material. The failure to identify updated regulatory requirements leads to operational practices that no longer meet legal thresholds. Just think about that for a second. Your factory equipment might be humming along perfectly, and your staff might be following their procedures to the letter, but legally, your entire operation is out of bounds because the threshold moved while you just weren't looking. Another systemic failure happens with ignored voluntary pledges. This usually occurs when a company promises stakeholders, like investors or customers, a lower carbon footprint, but they treat it purely as a marketing tool. They completely forget to put that obligation into the compliance register. To an ISO 14001:2026 auditor, a public pledge is a hard promise that must be backed by documented operational controls and real performance metrics. If it's not in the register, you're getting a non-conformance for sure.
So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If your stakeholders' environmental expectations changed tomorrow, if a brand new law passed, or your top client suddenly demanded new eco-friendly packaging, would your environmental management system actually know? Take the time to audit your own traceability threads. Ensure your compliance register is current, complete, and accurate. Because making sure your system is truly listening to the world around it, well, that's the absolute heart of effective environmental governance.